Up next is Matt Wisshak. He's an amazing caver and cave photographer and cartographer, he is also an amazing scientist. He's doing work in the field of marine research at the, and I'm going to brutalize this, Senckenberg Institute in Germany. He is a second generation Lech caver and has been doing a lot of work throughout the cave. He's doing ongoing speleothem research and biocorrosion experiments in Lechuguilla Cave. And with that, Max, you're up.
Yeah, hello everybody. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Good. So yeah, good morning everybody, or good evening, wherever you are on our blue planet. Today I want to talk about the Barite speleothems in Lechuguilla Cave and why they are so enigmatic, which basically is because usually barite that is found in caves has been interpreted to have formed in phreatic and hydrothermal settings in hypogene caves. And this is not the case for present day Lechuguilla Cave, where some of those barite speleothems are still actively growing. So I give this presentation here also on behalf of my co-authors, including Hazel Barton and Katie Bender, who is a PhD student in Hazel's lab in Akron, and also Harvey Duchenne, which I'm pretty sure most of you know, at least by name. So what is barite in either one of those two spellings? That's how barite looks like. So on the first side, you can see it's a fairly diverse mineral in terms of its shapes and also color. And some basic facts here, it's a barium sulfate. So it belongs to the sulfates, no wonder. It crystallizes in the orthorhombic system, has very different colors, intermediate hardness of 3. And this is something very typical for barite. It is fairly heavy, so a density of 4.5 grams per cubic centimeter. And that earned it the colloquial name heavy spar. The cleavage is perfect. That's another important issue also for our discussion later on. It's extremely low solubility in water, and it is soluble only in hot concentrated sulfuric acid, which you rarely find in nature. Its industrial use is owing to its high density. So it's being used as additive in drilling fluids or as contrast medium in medical X-ray analysis. And it occurs in fairly vast amounts in the marine realm. So for instance, along the mid-ocean ridges or in cold seeps. It's also found in ore deposits and, as we shall see, in caves. So this is Lechuguilla Cave once again, and up here in the middle, that's the entrance. It's colored by depth. And actually at the entrance, that's where most of you who have been into Lechuguilla Cave actually put your feet on barite, because there is a vein filling right where the rope goes across the lip. And this vein filling is composed of calcite interbedded with barite. However, this is not a speleothem. That's a vein filling of the so-called Mississippi Valley type that has formed a long time ago. It has formed actually before the cave formed along a tectonic lineage here. And so it's not a speleothem. So the first actual barite speleothems were discovered in a place called Frostbergs. This place was discovered during an expedition by Peter Bosted. And those are two of Peter's pictures he took from this area. And they noted these greenish stalactites, looked really weird, and documented them. And in the report of that expedition, Dick Laforge stated that there is this unusual mineral here. He put it in capital letters. And he also noted that, or he was asking the question, what could it be? He did recognize the high density of that mineral, and therefore he already concluded that it might be barite. So they took a sample, and it was Harvey who analyzed this sample. And the same year, he published a small note only about this finding, and he was able to confirm that this mineral is actually barite. And he also stated that, suffice to say, the barite is beautiful stuff, and I can only agree to that statement, of course. So afterwards, similar stalactites were also discovered in 2 other places nearby, one in Cephalodepank and another one, or several ones actually, in Chandelier Graveyard. So they are all basically in the same general area in the far western branch of the cave. And those are most of the ones we know today. So the upper ones are the ones in Frostworks. The right-hand side, this is Cephalodepank here. And the lower row here, those are all the ones in the Chandelier Graveyard, where they're a bit more bluish in coloration. And some of them have actually below them, I have to note, they are all have a moist surface and they all drip actively water today. And where this water hits on the floor, at some of these, there is the same mineral forming on the floor as well. So Harvey had a tiny bit of the sample left over and sent it over to me, to my lab here in Germany, to do further analysis with it. So that's the sample I got from him. And we see it's a stack of tabular crystals. It shows some parting. It confirms that it's an orthorhombic crystal, greenish color, partly translucent. And we see no obvious color zoning in this sample. So the first analysis I did was some SEM. So this is scanning electron microscopy to get a better idea about the crystal phases and the crystal shape and impurities and the sample and so on. But that's nothing I want to go into detail here. What we did then was some XRD, which is X-ray diffractometry. So that's a method that allows you to detect the mineral phase in your sample, and that clearly confirmed that this is barite. There was nothing else in the sample. We then did EDS, which is energy dispersive spectroscopy. And this is a method that allows you to determine the elements in your sample. And this confirmed that the elements are barium, sulfur, and oxygen, so the main constituents of barium sulfate. But we also detected some traces of strontium in the sample. And this analysis was also important because we did not detect any hint of witherite in the sample. Witherite is a barium carbonate, and it is an alteration product that is often occurring on barite. So there was no alteration going on this stalactites. We then did a bit of WDS. So that's another method. It's a wave dispersive spectroscopy, which is being done with a microprobe. And this allows us to do a high resolution elemental mapping of samples, cross-section, polished cross-sections. So in the upper row, we have a cross-section through this mineral. And this is a small detail, only this tiny little section here on the surface of it, which we mapped in 1 micrometer resolution. So this shows that the composition of the major elements is very homogeneous, so no alteration products whatsoever. We found another trace element in there, which is calcium. And we see that there's, this is a varying amount of this concentration, a varying concentration of it. It varies with the growth. And it also, more importantly, it varies with the direction the crystals grow in. So the concentrations are lower when the crystals grow in size, as opposed to much higher when they grow in width. And this is also seen here when we do a cross plot of those two. Those are these enigmatic numbers here. Those are the crystal phases. So they have different clusters. So this is basically just what I just told you. Yeah, anything? Okay, so those are the stalactites. And there's another type of barite, speleothems in the cave, which we discovered only a few years ago in an area called Blanca Navidad during resurvey of that area. Those are pool crystals. And this is the shallow pool in Blanca Navidad that contains hundreds of these crystallites. And here's a close-up of these tabular crystallites. And you see they have a nice bluish coloration to it. So we first thought that this is not barite, but celestite or celestine, which is a closely related mineral that often has this blue coloration. So we proposed sampling that and got approval to do so and went back the next year. This is the sample we got, a tabular crystal here broken in 2 parts and shows some parting. It again confirms the orthorhombic crystal shape here. It's bluish to translucent, and it does show some color zoning. So here on the white background, you can actually see that the outermost part here is deeper in color than the inner parts. So the same suite of analysis, we did some SEM first, and that gave us a surprise because we found 3 different types of microbes living on those crystals in this pool. And they're not only living there, but they are getting encrusted by the barite crystal. So this is actually a direct proof that those crystals are still growing today. And of course, Hazel got all excited about those microbes, and she actually raised the suspicion that the microbes might have something to do with the formation of the barite. That's something I'm going to talk about in a bit. So let's first go through the other analysis we did. Again, XRD and ADS, which confirmed barite, and a couple of only traces of calcite, which is simply the calcite pool spar that is being overgrown by the barite. We have the same elemental composition. We again found strontium in the sample as trace element and no traces whatsoever of witherite. The WDS turned out to be really interesting in this sample because we had a really high resolution variation, strong variation with growth. This is also interesting because trace elements or variations in trace element concentrations are often being used as geochemical archive for environmental conditions or environmental change. And that's something we definitely want to explore in more detail. What kind of environmental signal could be encoded in this strontium and calcium and maybe other more rare trace elements in the sample? That's something for future research. We also see again that the concentration varies depending on the direction the crystal grows. So this is nicely seen in this cross plot here of strontium versus calcite again. This is another cross section through the sample. And again, we have these strong variations in the concentrations. And again, we have these differences along which crystal phase the crystal grows. And this variation depends highly on that. So if you look at calcium, calcium here and strontium there, you see the difference as well. So this is just what I have told you. And this graph here summarizes our findings about the crystallography and also the geochemistry of both types of these barite speleothems in the cave. So these are the most important crystal phases encoded in these numbers here. That's how mineralogists describe a mineral shape. And we also see that there is some color zoning. And we actually found the highest concentration of strontium in the deepest blue zones. So we raised the suspicion that the color is probably a result of the strontium, but that's not a proof. We also see some parting, which is not to be confused with cleavage, but it's the same direction. This just means, parting means that there's the main crystal splits up into smaller crystallites in a certain direction. As far as the geochemistry is concerned, we have 2 different directions, so main directions of crystal growth. The crystal can either grow in size, so the tabular crystal gets larger, or the crystal can grow relatively much slower in thickness, if it grows at all in thickness. And this, the trace element concentration and the ratio between the 2 different trace elements will rise depending on this speed and crystal direction. That's important if you want to use those as environmental archive. So let's get to our conundrum, which is how did or do those Lechuguilla barite speleothems form? So first we need to establish what kind of environment are we looking at today. So for the frostworks stalactites, we have stalactitic growth. So this tells us it's an aerial setting, it's not phreatic. All those stalactites we have observed in the cave have a moist surface and they actively drip water. So this suggests that they might grow still today, but it's not a proof. But together with the facts that the supporting bedrock is still intact, so it's not corroded away by condensation corrosion, for instance. And also the fact that the splash points below those are not completely overgrown by carbonate speleothems, that actually really suggests that they are still growing today. And if they do, they grow in a temperature of 19 degrees Celsius at this level of the cave. So this is a normal temperature cave setting and not a hydrothermal setting. As for the Blanca Navidad pools, we know they are located in an active shallow pool. So this is a vadose setting, not a phreatic one. We see that the barite is overgrowing the calcite pool spar. And we have seen that there are incrustations. So the microbial filaments are encrusted in the barite, which is the proof that they are growing today. So they grow at the same temperature, 19 degrees Celsius. And that's, again, a normal temperature cave setting. So in conclusion, the mineralogenesis of the barite in Lechuguilla Cave we have observed is non-phreatic and a non-hydrothermal environment, in contrast to most of the other occurrences in the world, or at least their interpretation. So how can we explain that? There are three different models we can look into. The first one is the evaporation model, which basically means that if you have a lot of evaporation going on, that increases the concentration of the ions in your water until you have reached supersaturation, and that leads to the precipitation of barite. We know from Lechuguilla Cave that there's a lot of evaporation and condensation going on. There are prominent thermal atmospheric convection cells in the cave. We also know that there are a lot of speleothems that grow because of this evaporation, such as the aragonite frostwork or calcite popcorn and so on. And we can feel the significant airflow in many places in the cave. However, considering that barite has such a low solubility in water, this model would require quite immense amounts of water to evaporate until you have formed a speleothem of the size of those stalactites. And given that the water in Lechuguilla Cave is largely saturated or supersaturated with respect to carbonate, this evaporation would also result in lots of carbonate precipitation. So this does not really fit together. So in order to verify or falsify that model, we need water samples and we need evaporation rates. And that's something we want to do in the future. The next model is the mixing model, and this model can circumnavigate some of the problems of the evaporation model. The theory behind that is if you have water from two different sources, and one of these waters is fairly rich in barium and has no sulfate in it, and the other source is rich in sulfate. If you mix those types of water, that results in instant supersaturation with respect to barite and precipitation. This model is conceivable in the cave, for instance, where water stemming from condensation mixes with water that stems from percolating meteoric water. It is also conceivable at mixing points of meteoric water from different sources. So that's a possibility. And we know that there is a lot of mixing of water going on in this area, Blanca Navidad. And yesterday I have shown you nice examples of those subaqueous halictites, which form via the common ion effect. So there is mixing going on, and the pool is actually just a few meters away from such subaqueous halictites and from the gripping hand formation, which is also probably a result of this common ion effect. However, to verify this model, we need to identify these different sources of the water, and we need to sample them and do the water chemistry if that is possible. Something to do for the future. And finally, the microbe model. So Hadel told me that barium in water is toxic for microbes. So they have an interest in mediating precipitation of barites simply to detoxify the barium ions. This is known in many settings in nature. So there are some microbes that are known to form barite within their cells, but that's definitely not what we would expect in Lechuguilla Cave. We cannot explain the crystals we see in the pool. Also, some microbes are known to serve as nucleation sites for barite, but that does also not really explain how the barite pool crystals can form. And another version is that microbes are known to mediate precipitation when they oxidize either sulfur or sulfide. And this is more realistic because you have deposits of elemental sulfur in the cave, and you also have sulfides in the cave, such as pyrite in the bedrock or so. So the key might actually to look at deposits of elemental sulfur upstream of barite occurrences. And we found such an occurrence very close by to the pools we found in the Blanca area. And I showed this in my talk yesterday as well in a place called Barite Boulevard. So this might be the key, but to delve deeper into that, we need samples and we need to identify those microbes, to cultivate those microbes. We also need to do experiments to prove that they can precipitate barite mediated by those microbes. So a lot to do for the future. And of course, combinations of those three models here can also explain the precipitation of barite in the cave. So this brings me to the outlook. And it brings me to this other mineral I have briefly mentioned earlier, celestine or celestite, which, as the name suggests, usually has a sky blue coloration. And it's closely related because it's not barium sulfide, but it's strontium are interchangeable in this crystal lattice. So all contain lots of colors. Hardness is the same. Density is a little bit lower. Cleavage is perfect again. Solubility is very low again, although a bit higher than for barite. And the same applies here for the hard concentrated acids. In industrial use, it's being used as the major source of strontium for the industry. And in nature, it occurs mainly in hydrothermal vein deposits. It is also being found in salt deposits and in caves. So those are a couple of examples that might be celestite in Lechuguilla Cave. The upper two here, this is a spot in the Chandelier Maze we visited this year. This is in Emerald City, at the entrance of Emerald City, and John Lyles has shown this yesterday as well. And the two lower ones, this is a beautiful example here from a place in Ghost Town. So with the help of Erin Lynch from the Cave Resources Office, we dug through the mineral inventory of the cave, and those are all the occurrences we found that are either inferred or confirmed barite or celestine in the cave. So the idea of the plan is that we want to do an expedition into the cave, looking at most of these occurrences, documenting them, sampling them, placing data loggers at selected sites, placing evaporation experiments at selected sites. And this is the preliminary schedule for that, the 8-day expedition to visit almost all of these sites and also visit some of the sulfur, which is located near the pools. So we put in a bunch of proposals for doing that research. I have submitted a proposal to the German Research Foundation to do all the scientific analysis. We have put in a proposal to sample those minerals with the national park. We have also put in an expedition proposal submitted to the Cave Resources Office. So the title of this future study is Mineralogenesis and Geochemical Signature of those barite celestine series speleothems in Lechuguilla Cave. So the team, the science team, not the expedition team, I put together for that project includes a mineralogist from Bremen University who will do the XRD analysis and the crystallographic evaluation. There is the team of Norbert Frank at Heidelberg University. So he will do radiometric uranium series dating for establishing age models for those samples. There are 3 geochemists, Harald Strauss, Christoph Siebert, and Michael Böttcher. They are working on different stable isotope systems. And we have the quite unique opportunity to look at 4 different stable isotope systems together in the same sample on sulfur, oxygen, strontium, and barium. So those can also serve as environmental indicators and be used as geochemical archive. We can then also going to look into the trace elements in more detail. This is a team of Horst Marschall at the Frankfurt University and his colleagues. And of course, there's Hazel Barton again in the team for doing the water analysis and the microbe stuff. And there's Harvey again in the team. And as his last name suggests, he's kind of the big oak tree in the regional geology of that area, and also knows a lot about Lech mineralogy. It's very important to have him in the team again. So please keep your fingers crossed that those proposals will be granted, and also more importantly, keep your fingers crossed that we're gonna get rid of this damn virus so that we can actually resume exploring the cave and doing the science stuff here. In the meanwhile, if you're interested in our study, we have just published the first results in the International Journal of Speleology. It's an open access journal, so you can download this paper for free. And the last few seconds, if I may, just a small anecdote. This is a picture of the pool, one of the pools in Barite Boulevard, which we discovered last year, and which contains some of the barite back in here, for instance. And when the park went ahead and posted this picture on Facebook, it created a lot of attention. And I am not on Facebook, so I don't know what went on there. But the media picked it up, and so they got excited about it too and asked the question, what kind of strange liquid is this in this pool? So for those few journalists that actually contacted me directly to ask that question, I had to tell them, well, that's simply water. So they were really disappointed and had to build their story on something else, which they did. But anyway, if you have questions on those barite matters, I would be really happy to try to answer them.